Have you ever noticed that sometimes when the money runs out on the exact same day your paycheck hits, the feeling is strangely familiar, almost comfortable, even though it's bad? And that when a little bit is left over, just a little, the mind seems to panic, as if that extra money were a new problem you don't know how to deal with. Have you ever felt that when nothing is left, you suffer, but you suffer in a predictable way? And when something is left over, the fear changes shape, becomes quieter and more constant, as if any mistake could make everything collapse. Almost no one talks about this. But this is exactly where the real importance of spending less than you earn begins, not as a spreadsheet rule, not as expert advice, but as an emotional, mental, day-to-day survival issue. Because spending everything you make is bad, of course, but spending almost everything is often worse. Because you start living in a strange state where there is something to lose, but not enough to feel safe. This is the point where many people get stuck, sabotage themselves, and give up, thinking the problem is a lack of discipline, when in reality it's a lack of understanding of what's happening inside their own head. Most people grow up hearing that the financial problem is earning too little, and that even seems logical. Because when your income is low, everything feels tight. But over Chimi, even when the paycheck increases a bit, the feeling of suffocation remains, and then that heavy sentence is born. The one many people carry in silence. It doesn't matter how much I make, it's never enough. That sentence hurts because it comes with guilt, shame, and a sense of personal incompetence, as if everyone else learned something you didn't. But the truth is more uncomfortable and, at the same time, more liberating. The human brain was not made to deal well with the idea of having just a little left over. When nothing is left, the brain goes into full survival mode, puts out fires, pays bills, pushes problems forward, and keeps going. When a little is left over, but not enough to change the game, the brain starts to watch, to protect, to anticipate losses. And that creates an absurd amount of mental exhaustion. You start thinking about money all the time, even when you're really not spending it. You fall asleep wondering if you'll need to use that leftover. You wake up mentally calculating how much is still there. And without realizing it, money starts to occupy more space in your head than when you had nothing saved. This is where many people make a silent and extremely common mistake. They think that spending less than you earn is just about having money left at the end of the month. And when a little is left, the person believes they're on the right path, but emotionally they're at the worst possible point. Because they don't feel poor enough to accept chaos, nor secure enough to relax. They live in an emotional middle ground that generates constant anxiety. Any unplanned expense becomes a threat. Any invitation turns into an internal conflict. Any small problem seems too big. And the cruelest part is that no one around notices this, because on the outside it looks like the person is getting organized. Spending less than you earn doesn't start with numbers. It starts with a brutal change in your relationship with your own money. It begins when you understand that having nothing left keeps you in predictable suffering, but having a little left keeps you in constant suffering. That's why so many people give up on getting organized financially right at the beginning. They start motivated, cut a few expenses, see 200 reais left over, and instead of feeling relief, they feel more fear than before. Fear of losing it, fear of spending it wrong, fear of needing that money later, and then they think, this isn't for me, when in reality they stopped exactly at the most uncomfortable point of the process. There's an emotional injustice here that no one talks about. Society sells the idea that any leftover is already a victory, that any control is already maturity. But the brain doesn't work that way. It needs margin, space, real breathing room to leave the state of alert. While that breathing room doesn't exist, spending less than you earn feels like punishment, like restriction, like a gray life. The person starts to associate financial organization with suffering, with giving up everything that brings pleasure, with always counting coins. And that association is dangerous because at the first difficulty, they throw everything away and go back to the old pattern, which at least was familiar.
Maybe you recognize yourself in this without ever having put it into words. Maybe you've already tried to spend less than you earn and felt that your life became emotionally tighter, even with some money left over. Maybe you felt angry hearing advice that was too simple, as if the problem were a lack of willpower. But it isn't. The problem is that spending less than you earn directly touches the fear of losing, and the fear of losing is one of the strongest feelings there is. It's stronger than the joy of gaining. Losing $100 hurts more than gaining $100 brings joy. And when you start saving even a little, you activate that fear daily. That's why so many people unconsciously prefer to spend everything. When there's nothing saved, there's nothing to lose. The stress exists, but it's diffuse, spread out, almost automatic. Bills arrive. You pay what you can, push what you can't, and move on. When money starts to be left over, the stress changes shape. It becomes focused. It has a number, has a specific amount you don't want to see shrink. But here's a point almost no one explains clearly. Spending less than you earn is not about the money that's left over. It's about what happens in your head when that leftover starts to grow enough to change the internal game. There's an invisible threshold, a point where the leftover stops being a threat and becomes support. But before you reach it, the path is uncomfortable, confusing, and emotionally heavy. And if you don't understand this, you give up thinking you're doing something wrong, when in reality, you're exactly where you should be. Most people never get past this point because no one warned them it existed. No one said that spending less than you earn does not bring immediate peace. On the contrary, at first it brings more questions, more doubts, and more fear. And that's where everyday financial drama intensifies. The person starts to pressure themselves more, starts comparing themselves, starts thinking they're weak, disorganized, irresponsible. And all of this happens while, technically, they're doing the right thing. This is the kind of silent suffering that doesn't show up in any spreadsheet. It's the suffering of opening your banking app several times a day, of mentally recalculating the entire month with every small purchase, of feeling guilt for spending and fear for not spending, of living on an emotional tightrope. And if you're there right now, it's important to understand one thing before any practical tip. The discomfort you feel is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of transition.
Hey.
But that only makes sense when you understand the whole process, not just the beginning. Many people believe that spending less than you earn is a rational choice, when in reality it's a psychological adaptation. You're teaching your brain to deal with something it wasn't used to, the idea of the future. When you spend everything, you live only in a forced present. When you start spending less, the future enters the conversation. And the future is scary because it's uncertain. It brings questions you were avoiding. What if I lose my job? What if something happens? What if this isn't enough? These questions don't appear because you're doing badly, but because now you have something that connects today to tomorrow. And that's exactly why so many people feel that their financial life gets heavier at the beginning of organization. It's not because it's worse, but because now it's being seen. Before it was chaos, but familiar chaos. Now it's partial control, and partial control is the most uncomfortable stage that exists. You see the problems, but you still don't have enough structure to feel protected from them. All of this needs to be said honestly, because no one changes such a deep behavior without understanding what they're feeling. Spending less than you earn isn't just closing your wallet. It's opening a box of emotions that have been dormant for years. Emotions of fear, inadequacy, comparison, exhaustion. And if you're not prepared for that, you think the problem is you. When in reality, the problem is that they only taught you the rule, but didn't explain the impact. This is just the beginning of the conversation. Up to this point, you might be thinking that maybe it's not worth it, that it's better to stay the way things are. But that conclusion would be rushed. The initial discomfort is not the final destination. It's a phase. A phase that almost everyone goes through in silence, and that defines who manages to escape mental suffocation and who spends an entire life earning and spending without ever feeling in control. Before talking about solutions, paths, and practical changes, it was necessary to understand this pain because without that, any advice turns into empty pressure. Spending less than you earn only starts to make sense when you understand why. In the beginning, it seems to do so little. After a person understands that the initial discomfort is part of the process, something starts to change inside, even if on the outside nothing seems resolved yet. The salary stays the same, the bills keep coming, the invoices don't shrink on their own, but perception changes. Perception is everything when it comes to money, because up to this point, spending less than you earn was experienced as loss, as restriction, as threat. The mind was focused on what it could no longer do, on what it had to give up, on the constant fear of making a mistake. But there comes a moment when the question changes. instead of what if I lose this. It slowly becomes, what is this preventing me from losing? This shift is slow, almost imperceptible, but decisive. At first, when a little is left over, the person thinks that money is there to be used for big, almost tragic emergencies. A serious problem, a layoff, an illness. And since these things don't happen every month, the idle money starts to bother them. It feels useless, too small to solve something big. And then a silent temptation is born, using it for smaller, justifiable, seemingly harmless things. One expense here, another there, always with the feeling of, I'll get better organized later. And when they realize it, that leftover that caused anxiety is also gone, and along with it comes a strange relief, almost a sense of returning to normal. This is dangerous because it teaches the brain that spending brings immediate relief, while saving brings tension. This is one of the cruelest points of the process of spending less than you earn. The wrong relief comes fast. The right relief takes time. The human brain likes immediate solutions, not slow construction. So it starts to sabotage the process in very subtle ways. It's not a conscious decision. It's a thought like, just this once, I deserve it. This won't make a difference. And taken alone, it really doesn't. The problem isn't the amount, it's the message you send yourself. Every time you use the leftover to relieve emotional tension, you reinforce the idea that money exists to numb, not to structure. And here's a very common confusion. People think that spending less than you earn is learning to say no to consumption, when in reality it's learning to say no to panic. Because most unnecessary spending doesn't come from real desire. It comes from anxiety, from exhaustion, from a sense of injustice, from the thought I work so hard and have nothing. When you start saving, that thought doesn't disappear. It actually increases at first. And if you don't understand that, you use money as an escape valve, then feel guilty. Which creates more anxiety, which creates more spending. It's a silent and very common cycle. Over time, if the person manages not to give up in this phase, something starts to organize internally. The leftover stops being seen as a specific amount and starts to be felt as margin. It's no longer I have $300, but I have room to make a small mistake without everything collapsing. This change is profound, because money stops being the center of attention and becomes the background. You no longer wake up thinking about it all the time. You don't compulsively check your balance. You start solving small problems with less drama. And this doesn't happen when a little is left over for a month or two. It happens when consistency starts teaching the brain that this isn't temporary. Spending less than you earn only begins to fulfill its real function when it reduces the volume of daily decisions. Before, every expense was a heavy choice. Every purchase came loaded with guilt or fear. When the margin grows, even slowly, money starts to function as an emotional shock absorber. Flat tire bursts in the first pothole. A properly inflated tire absorbs the impact. But a reserve does exactly that for your mind. It doesn't eliminate problems, but it prevents every problem from turning into a crisis. At this point, the person realizes something that was never taught. The biggest benefit of spending less than you earn is not the money accumulated. It's the mental energy preserved. Fewer internal fights, fewer negotiations with yourself, less emotional wear. Financial life stops being a constant minefield, and that changes everything. It changes how you work, how you sleep, how you relate to others. Because when money stops taking up so much space in your head, there's space left to think better. But getting here requires crossing that ungrateful phase where it feels like you're doing everything right and still feeling worse. That's why so many people stop halfway. Not because they're incapable, but because no one warned them that the crossing hurts. Spending less than you earn is like learning to walk after years of limping. At first, it hurts more than continuing the wrong way. Only later does the body understand that the effort makes sense. If you look closely, you'll notice that people who seem financially calm are not the ones who earn fortunes, but the ones who have margin. They make mistakes, spend wrong sometimes, face unexpected events, but they don't collapse with each one. And that calm didn't come from one good month. It came from a repeated pattern. From consistently spending less than they earn, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it seemed useless, even when no one applauded. Up to this point, the conversation is still in the emotional realm, because without fixing that, any practical strategy turns into punishment. Before talking about amounts, percentages, or methods, it's necessary to understand that spending less than you earn is not about living less. It's about living without always being at the limit. And constant limits exhaust, sicken, and distort decisions. In the next chapters, we'll go into how to turn the habit of spending less than you earn into something automatic that doesn't depend on willpower, and how to use that margin to leave survival mode and enter choice mode. But that only makes sense after everything that's been said so far. There's a specific moment when spending less than you earn stops being a daily struggle and starts becoming a silent background of life. It's not a marked day. It doesn't come with a sense of victory. There are no fireworks. It's almost disappointing in how discreet it is. You only notice afterward. You notice when a problem comes up that would have kept you awake before, and this time it just bothers you. You notice when an unexpected expense appears, and you handle it without panic. You notice when money stops being the first thought of the day and the last before sleep. This moment doesn't happen because you became more disciplined. It happens because your brain finally understood that you're no longer standing on the edge of the abyss all the time.
Before that, everything is conscious effort. You think before spending, you hold back, you negotiate with yourself. That's exhausting. And many people confuse that exhaustion with a sign that they're living badly. But in reality, it's the exhaustion of dismantling an old pattern. The pattern of spending everything you earn creates a false sense of flow. Money comes in, money goes out, and life runs on autopilot. When you start spending less than you earn, that autopilot breaks. You start seeing money stop, accumulate, wait. And waiting is uncomfortable. For those who spent their whole life solving everything urgently, urgency is addictive. It creates adrenaline. It gives a sense of movement, even when you've been stuck in the same place for years. Spending everything you earn keeps the mind busy, worried, but curiously numbed. You're always putting out fires, never thinking about the structure of the house. When you start spending less, the fires diminish, and then silence appears. And silence is scary, because in it appear questions you've been postponing for a long time. Questions about choices, about the future, about limits, about what you really can or cannot do. That's why spending less than you earn doesn't transform financial life on its own. It creates space, and space exposes. Exposure hurts, but it also allows adjustment. The problem is that no one talks about this part. Everyone sells the idea that having money left over brings immediate peace. It doesn't. What brings peace is the consolidated habit, not the money itself. While the leftover still feels fragile, it generates more vigilance than tranquility. Only when it stops feeling like an exception and starts feeling like a pattern does the brain relax. At that point, something important happens. You stop treating every expense as a moral judgment. Before, spending was wrong or right. Saving was virtue. Using the reserve was failure. That logic is too heavy. When spending less than you earn becomes a pattern, money stops being a character test. It becomes a tool. You use it when you need to, replenish it later without drama. Without that feeling that everything is always hanging by a thread. That maturity doesn't come from understanding concepts. It comes from repetition. And that's when many people finally understand that spending less than you earn is not living tightly. It's living with shock absorbers. Shock absorbers don't prevent potholes, but they prevent every pothole from breaking the entire car. Before, any unexpected event shook everything. After, the unexpected becomes just another adjustment along the way. And that completely changes how you face life. Because when money stops being a constant threat, you start making better decisions in other areas too. This change is silent, but deep. And it only happens when you cross that initial ungrateful stretch where it feels like the effort isn't worth it. It is worth it, but not in the way it's sold out there. It's not euphoria, it's stability. It's not a feeling of wealth. It's a feeling of ground. And for someone who's spent their whole life slipping, having ground is already a revolution. After this pattern starts to take hold, a perception emerges that completely changes the relationship with money. You understand that spending less than you earn is not for accumulating, it's for choosing. Before, almost everything in your financial life was reaction. The bill arrived, you reacted, the unexpected happened, you reacted, a promotion appeared, you reacted. The choice came after the impact. When there's margin, the order reverses. You choose first, pay later. And this inversion is one of the greatest sources of mental relief there is. When you live spending everything, money is in charge. It dictates what you can do, what you can't, what scares you, what embarrasses you. When you start spending less, even without realizing it, you start to be in charge a little more. Not because you got rich, but because you stopped being cornered. The difference between being tight and being without margin is huge. Being tight is uncomfortable. Being without margin is paralyzing. Spending less than you earn gives movement back. And that's when it becomes clear why so many people feel they work hard and don't go anywhere. It's not just because they earn little, it's because all the money is already born, committed to the past. Debts, bills, old decisions. When you start spending less, a part of the money stops serving the past and starts serving the future. At first, it's a small part, almost symbolic, but symbolically powerful. It tells your brain, not everything I earn is already condemned. That feeling changes how you look at work, consumption, and even rest. You stop spending to compensate for frustration. You stop buying to relieve exhaustion. You stop punishing yourself for not having what others have, because now there's an implicit plan, even if you never wrote one. There's direction, and direction relieves more than any specific amount. Spending less than you earn also reveals something many people avoid admitting. Many financial pains are not lack of money, they're lack of predictability. Not knowing what will happen hurts more than knowing it will be tight. When there's margin, the future stops being a scary blur and becomes something foggy but navigable. You don't control everything, but you're not adrift either. From here on, money starts to play a completely different role. It stops being a harsh judge and becomes a life organizer. You don't get rich, you get stable. And stability, for someone who has lived years at the limit, is almost an emotional luxury. It's waking up without that weight in your chest. It's solving a problem without desperation. It's being able to think clearly. All of this comes from something simple but difficult. Spending less than you earn consistently, even when it seems boring, even when no one notices, even when the result hasn't appeared yet. Not because it transforms you financially overnight, but because it transforms how you deal with your own reality. There comes a point where spending less than you earn stops being something you do and becomes something that simply happens. Not because you became another person, but because the environment around you changed. Decisions become less emotional, less urgent, less loaded with guilt. You no longer need to convince yourself all the time that you're doing the right thing. The right thing starts to feel obvious. And when something feels obvious, it doesn't consume energy. That's one of the clearest signs that the relationship with money is starting to heal. Before that, every financial choice came with a heavy internal conversation. Buy or not buy. Save or not save. Pay now or push it forward. This constant conversation is more exhausting than the problem itself. When spending less than you earn becomes a pattern, this conversation diminishes. It doesn't disappear completely, but it stops being daily. You no longer need to justify yourself all the time. And this reduction of mental friction is one of the biggest transformations this habit causes. At that moment, the person starts to notice something curious. The money hasn't changed that much. But the sense of control has changed a lot. The numbers are still limited, but the mind is no longer at the limit. This happens because now there is predictability. You more or less know how the month will end. You know that a small mistake won't destroy everything. You know that not every decision has to be perfect. This predictability creates calm, and calm improves decisions. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. When the mind leaves survival mode, it starts to see options that were previously invisible. Before, the only question was, can I or can't I? Now, other healthier ones start to appear. Is this worth it? Does this make sense right now? Does this bring me closer to or further from the life I want? These questions only appear when fear diminishes. And fear only diminishes when spending less than you earn stops being an exception and becomes a silent rule. Many people never get here because they think financial organization is living stuck. But it's the opposite. Living stuck is having no margin at all. It's needing everything that comes in. It's always living with a sense of delay. When you spend less than you earn, you create space to make mistakes, to change your mind, to breathe, and that's practical freedom, not a pretty speech. That freedom doesn't come from big amounts. It comes from consistency. It comes from repeated months, without drama, without perfection, without miracle promises. It comes from messing up and adjusting, from spending wrong one month and compensating the next, from using the margin when you need to and rebuilding it later. It's a human process, not an idealized project, And the more human it becomes, the more sustainable it is. Over time, money stops being the villain of the story and becomes a neutral resource. It doesn't solve everything, but it doesn't threaten everything either. It occupies the right place. Neither the absolute center of life nor a taboo, just a tool. And when money becomes a tool, it stops hurting emotionally. Up to this stage, something important happens. The person stops feeling ashamed of their own financial situation. Not because everything is resolved, but because now there is coherence. There is direction. There is effort that makes sense. Shame is born much more from the feeling of lack of control than from lack of money itself. When lack of control diminishes, shame loses strength. That's when financial life stops being a constant weight and becomes just one area of life, not the person's entire identity. And that deeply changes how they see themselves, how they compare themselves, how they position themselves in the world. Spending less than you earn doesn't just improve the balance. It improves the respect you have for yourself. And the more that respect grows, the less you feel the need to prove something through consumption. Fewer impulsive purchases, fewer expenses to compensate for frustration, fewer decisions made out of exhaustion, not because you became enlightened, but because money no longer needs to fulfill emotional functions it was never meant to fulfill. There's an important detail that almost no one notices at this point in the process. When spending less than you earn becomes a pattern, you stop living putting out fires and start little by little taking care of the structure. Before, every problem was treated as an emergency. Now, some problems become just maintenance. And that changes everything, because emergencies consume energy while maintenance preserves energy. Before, you lived solving consequences. Now, you start reducing causes. Small adjustments prevent big pain. Small decisions prevent big regrets. And this is only possible when there's margin. Without margin, everything is reaction. With margin, prevention appears. And prevention is a luxury for those who have always lived at the limit. This new phase also changes the relationship with time. Before, everything was now or never. Today, where everything falls apart. When you spend less than you earn, time becomes an ally again. You can wait, you can postpone, you can plan. And the ability to wait is one of the biggest differences between those who live under pressure and those who live with some stability. That's why spending less than you earn is not about restriction. It's about deceleration. It's taking your foot off the emotional accelerator. It's leaving that constant state of alert where any unexpected event feels like a threat of collapse. Little by little, the body relaxes, the mind clears, decisions improve, and the more decisions improve, the less effort is needed to maintain the habit. It sustains itself, not because you're strong, but because the system is on your side. Spending less than you earn stops being a daily battle and becomes simply the way your life works. At this point, the person usually looks back and realizes that the biggest gain wasn't financial, it was mental. It was leaving that feeling of always being behind, always owing, always running. It was trading urgency for clarity, and clarity changes destinies even when the numbers are still modest. All of this happens without announcement, without milestones, without epic moments. The transformation is silent, but it's real. And it always begins the same simple and difficult way, spending less than you earn, even when it seems small, even when it seems slow, even when no one is watching. When this phase of stability starts to consolidate, something changes in how you see your own financial past. That sequence of mistakes, bad decisions, and tight months stops looking like proof of incapacity and starts looking like lack of structure. You start to realize it wasn't lack of character or laziness or chronic irritation. It was living in a system where any slip had consequences that were too big. And this understanding brings a kind of relief that has no price because it gives dignity back. Many people carry guilt for years, thinking that if I were better with money, everything would have been different. But when you start spending less than you earn consistently, you see in practice that the problem was never moral, it was structural. No one makes good decisions when they're under pressure all the time. No one thinks clearly when every choice feels like a risk of falling. Margin doesn't turn you into a better person. It simply allows you to function like a normal human being. This perception even changes how you compare yourself to others. Before any comparison hurt, it felt like everyone was moving forward while you stayed behind. Now, comparison loses strength not because you became indifferent, but because there is finally your own path. There is internal progress, even if external progress is still discrete. And when there is real progress, the need for external validation diminishes. This is where spending less than you earn starts to create a curious effect. You begin to respect yourself more in small decisions. Not because they're big, but because now they connect. Before, each choice felt isolated. Now, they're part of something bigger that changes the weight of an expense, of a choice, of a postponement. Everything gains context, and context removes drama. Over time, you start to notice that money has stopped being a constant problem and has become a punctual subject. It shows up when it needs to show up and disappears when it doesn't. That's practical freedom. It's not absence of concern, it's absence of obsession. And that difference is enormous for someone who spent years with their head almost exclusively occupied by bills, deadlines, and fear of running out. This new relationship also changes how you react to mistakes. Before, making a financial mistake seemed to confirm all your insecurities. Now, a mistake becomes an adjustment. You observe, correct, and move on. Without internal whipping, without self-attack, because there's margin to learn. And learning without punishment is one of the rarest things in adult life. When spending less than you earn reaches this stage, it stops being a goal and becomes a foundation. You don't think about it all the time, just as no one thinks about the ground all the time while walking. But it's precisely because the ground is there that you can walk. This silent base supports bigger decisions, bolder changes, and choices that once seemed impossible. There is also a subtle but deep change in how you deal with the future. Before, thinking about the future was synonymous with anxiety. Now, it becomes synonymous with organization. Not because everything is guaranteed, but because now there is continuity. Tomorrow stops being a leap in the dark and becomes a continuation of today. This reduces the fear of planning and increases confidence in taking gradual steps. This confidence doesn't come from optimism. It comes from evidence. You've seen that you can spend less than you earn. You've seen that you can maintain this for months. You've seen that the world doesn't end when you don't solve everything at once. This practical evidence builds a security much more solid than any momentary motivation. From there, important decisions start to be thought through more calmly. Changing jobs, moving cities, studying, personal projects. Before, everything seemed too risky. Now, it's still risky, but manageable. And the difference between risk and panic is exactly marginal. Spending less than you earn doesn't eliminate risks, but it prevents them from paralyzing you. At this point, financial life starts to stop being purely defensive. Before, everything was about avoiding the worst. Now, there begins to be space to build something better. Not grand, not fantastical, but better than before. A little more organized, a little more predictable, a little lighter, and that is already real transformation. This construction is slow, but continuous. It doesn't depend on luck, nor on a perfect month, nor on a brilliant decision. It depends only on keeping the basics working, spending less than you earn, repeating, adjusting, continuing. It's simple to understand, hard to sustain at first, and extremely powerful when it becomes routine. And when it becomes routine, money finally takes the right place in your life. Neither center nor villain, just part of the scenery. And when money leaves the center, life gains room to breathe. There comes a moment when the person realizes that spending less than you earn didn't just change the relationship with money, it changed the rhythm of life itself. Things feel less rushed inside, even if on the outside everything remains demanding. You still work, still face problems, still have hard days, but the feeling of always chasing something diminishes. And that happens because now there is a base, an invisible but constant base that supports bad days without turning everything into disaster. Before, any setback had a disproportionate weight, a delay, an unexpected expense. A small mistake became a reason for despair. Now, those same events still bother you, but they don't dominate. They enter your life as adjustments, not as threats. And that difference deeply changes how you feel about yourself. You stop seeing yourself as someone always on the brink of failure and start seeing yourself as someone under construction. This internal change is one of the most important of the entire process. Because while you see yourself as someone bad with money, every attempt to improve feels artificial, forced, temporary. When that identity starts to fall, everything gets lighter. You're no longer trying to become another person. You're simply functioning better within the life you have. Spending less than you earn stops being a project of personal correction and becomes basic self. Over time, this financial base starts to reflect in other areas. You speak with less fear. You say no without guilt. You accept limits without shame. Because now there's coherence between what you earn, what you spend, and what you expect from life. This coherence brings peace. Not perfect peace, but possible peace. And for someone who lived years in internal conflict, that's huge. This is where many people realize that money was never the main problem. The problem was living without emotional margin. It was always reacting, always justifying, always defending yourself from the next impact. Spending less than you earn creates an invisible cushion that absorbs not only expenses, but feelings. It reduces the intensity of guilt, fear, and shame. And that changes everything. You begin to allow yourself to think about things that once seemed forbidden. Not grand dreams, but simple questions. What if I organized this better? What if I changed little by little? What if I didn't have to suffer so much? These questions only appear when the nervous system relaxes. And the nervous system only relaxes when there is minimal predictability. When this predictability settles in, even if still fragile, something emerges that many people have never experienced in adult life: continuity, the feeling that one month doesn't erase the previous one. That effort doesn't disappear the day after the paycheck arrives. Before, every month was a forced restart. Now, months connect, one builds on the other, and this continuity is the basis of any lasting change. And when this trust settles in, money stops being a silent enemy and becomes a discreet ally. It doesn't solve your existential problems, but it doesn't amplify them either. It supports, absorbs, organizes, and that's all it ever needed to be. There comes a point when the person realizes they are no longer trying to fix themselves financially. This may be one of the biggest turning points of the entire journey. Before, every attempt to spend less than you earn was loaded with pressure, self-criticism, and a feeling that something was wrong with them. Now, that disappears. Not because everything is resolved, but because the logic changes. The focus shifts from correcting flaws to sustaining what works. This change removes a huge weight from your shoulders, because trying to fix yourself all the time is exhausting. It's living at war with yourself. When spending less than you earn becomes natural, you're no longer constantly fighting your impulses. You simply created an environment where they have less power. And that's far more effective than willpower. After this stage, the person begins to realize they no longer need constant motivation to keep going. They don't depend on inspirational videos, catchphrases, or miracle promises. They continue because stopping no longer makes sense. Spending everything you earn now feels strange, uncomfortable, almost emotionally irresponsible. Not for moral reasons, but because you've already felt, in your own body, the cost of living without margin. This inversion is powerful. What once required effort now requires effort to abandon. And when something reaches that point, it sustains itself. It's not rigid discipline. It's practical identity. You're not trying to spend less than you earn. You're someone who lives that way as best you can with mistakes, adjustments, and continuity. This identity brings a new tranquility. You no longer feel like you're always behind in life. You no longer feel like everyone else understood something you didn't. You start trusting your own pace. And trusting your own pace is liberating because it removes the destructive rush that leads to bad decisions. With this base consolidated, the relationship with money finally becomes proportional to its real importance. It stops being the center of emotions and becomes silent support. You don't think about it all the time, but you feel when it's there, like solid ground under your feet. You don't thank the ground at every step, but you notice when it's missing. This emotional stability allows something that once seemed impossible, thinking about the future without fear. Not an idealized, distant, perfect future, but the next step, the next adjustment, the next slightly better choice. Spending less than you earn doesn't create a magical future, but it creates enough continuity for the future to stop being scary. At that moment, the person understands that the greatest achievement wasn't financial, it was psychological. It was leaving the constant state of alert. It was stopping living in anticipation of the next impact. It was learning that life has ups and downs, but that not every low has to turn into desperation. This understanding changes how you live, not just how you spend. That's why so many people who get here never go back to the previous chaos. Not because they got rich, but because they became lucid. Because they understood the invisible price of living without margin. Because they felt the real relief of not always being at the limit. And once you feel that, giving it up feels too expensive. Spending less than you earn, in the end, is not about money left over. It's about mental space. It's about being able to breathe between one problem and another. It's about treating your own life with less internal violence. And when you understand that, the habit stops feeling heavy and starts feeling obvious. When the person reaches this stage, they realize something they had never stopped to formulate. Money stopped being the central problem of life, even without becoming abundant. This breaks a deep, almost automatic belief that tranquility only exists when there is plenty left over. Now, it's clear that tranquility came before the big surplus. It came from minimal organization, basic predictability, the feeling that not everything is out of control. And that completely changes how they interpret their own story. Before, the internal narrative was always heavy. I don't know how to deal with money. I always mess up. I'll never get anywhere. These phrases felt like absolute truths. Now, they lose strength. Not because better motivational phrases appeared, but because reality began to contradict them. Spending less than you earn, repeated over time, creates silent evidence of competence. Small, discreet, but real. And evidence changes beliefs. This shift in internal narrative is one of the deepest parts of the entire process. Because while you see yourself as incapable, any attempt to improve becomes a fragile exception. When you start seeing yourself as someone under construction, every step counts. Every month counts. Every adjustment counts. And that creates a much healthier relationship with mistakes and successes. At this point, the person understands that they didn't need more pressure. They needed more structure. They needed a simple system that protected them from their own moments of exhaustion, anxiety, and spending less than you earn didn't solve everything. But it created that system. A system that doesn't demand perfection, only continuity. And continuity is something ordinary people can sustain. This understanding also changes how the person listens to financial advice. Before, everything seemed distant, too technical, or unrealistic. Now, they can separate what makes sense from what is fantasy. Because there is internal ground that allows calm evaluation. Urgency is diminished, and when urgency diminishes, discernment increases. With that, a new autonomy emerges. You no longer depend so much on external opinions to decide. You trust your perception more, not because you know everything, but because you know how to observe. You know how to feel when something weighs too much. You know how to recognize when a decision threatens the margin you've built. And this sensitivity is an advanced form of financial intelligence, even if it never gets that name. This connection between months creates a different perception of time. The future stops being something distant and threatening and becomes an extension of the present. You don't need to solve everything now because you know there will be a later, and knowing there will be a later reduces the anxiety of solving everything at once. Spending less than you earn gives time back as an ally. From there on, money starts to serve a very simple but powerful purpose, preventing small problems from becoming big problems. A delay doesn't become a debt. An unexpected expense doesn't become loss of control. A mistake doesn't become collapse. This basic function, which seems small, is what separates an exhausted financial life from a manageable one. That's why the goal was never to accumulate for accumulation's sake. The goal was always to stop bleeding mental energy, to stop spending hours of the day worried about what could go wrong, to stop living with that constant feeling that anything could knock everything down. Spending less than you earn closes invisible leaks that no one sees, but that slowly drain life. At this stage, the person no longer looks for shortcuts. They don't look for magic solutions. They don't want easy money promises because they've already understood in body and mind that stability is built on the basics done well. And that completely changes the relationship with any financial content. The gaze becomes more critical, calmer, less desperate. This maturity doesn't come from studying finance. It comes from living with margin, from making mistakes with protection, from going through difficult months without losing everything, from realizing that chaos is not inevitable. And that realization is liberating. When you get here, spending less than you earn has fulfilled its main mission. It took you out of survival mode and put you into management of your own life. Not cold, mathematical management, but human, possible, imperfect, continuous management. And that changes how you relate to money forever. There comes a phase when the person realizes something almost unsettling. Life didn't become perfect, money didn't become abundant, problems didn't disappear, but the feeling of suffocation clearly diminished. And that's surprising, because for a long time, they believed they would only feel okay when they earned more, when they solved everything, when they finally got there. But now they understand that the greatest weight didn't come from absolute lack of money. It came from the absence of minimal control over their own path. This perception changes how the person pressures themselves. Before, any slip became proof of failure. Now, it becomes part of the process. Self-criticism loses aggressiveness. You start treating yourself with more realism, not with complacency, but with fairness. You understand that you're dealing with real limits, with a real life, and that spending less than you earn is a tool to navigate that reality, not a test to measure personal worth. At this point, financial anxiety stops being constant and becomes episodic. It appears in specific moments, in concrete situations, and then goes away. Before, it was the background of everything. It was always there, even on good days. This difference profoundly changes quality of life, because living with permanent anxiety wears you down more than living with occasional problems. The person also starts to notice that many internal conflicts have diminished. Fewer mental arguments before spending, less regret afterward, less need to justify choices. This doesn't happen because everything is now allowed, but because there is coherence. Spending less than you earn creates alignment between intention and action, and alignment brings peace. This is where the relationship with money stops being dramatic. It doesn't become indifferent, but proportional. Small problems generate small annoyances. Medium problems generate medium concern. Nothing automatically explodes. This proportionality is a sign of emotional financial health. It's when money finally occupies the right size within life. At this more mature stage, the person begins to clearly see something that was previously invisible. How much it costs to live at the limit, not just in money, but in energy, mood, patience, relationships. They realized they were always tired, always irritated, always at the edge, and thought that was normal. Now they understand that much of that work came from constant financial tension. With this clarity, a new kind of care emerges. You start protecting your margin not out of fear, but out of respect. You understand that that breathing room is not just for financial emergencies, but for emotional emergencies, for bad days, for difficult phases, for moments when life weighs more. Spending less than you earn becomes an act of self-protection. This care also changes how you face bigger choices. You don't jump into impulsive decisions thinking I'll figure it out later. You learn to test, adjust, and move forward gradually, not out of cowardice, but emotional intelligence. Margin allows you to make mistakes without destroying everything, and that makes mistakes less frightening. Little by little, you start trusting yourself more. Not because everything went right, but because you saw that you can handle things when something goes wrong. This trust is built in practice, month after month, and is much stronger than any external motivation. It's born from the direct experience of spending less than you earn and surviving life's ups and downs without collapsing. And when this trust settles in, money stops being a silent enemy and becomes a discreet ally. It doesn't solve your existential problems, but it doesn't amplify them either. It supports, absorbs, organizes, and that's all it ever needed to be. There comes a point when the person realizes they are no longer trying to fix themselves financially. This may be one of the biggest turning points of the entire journey. Before, every attempt to spend less than you earn was loaded with pressure, self-criticism, and a feeling that something was wrong with them. Now, that disappears. Not because everything is resolved, but because the logic changes. The focus shifts from correcting flaws to sustaining what works. This change removes a huge weight from your shoulders, because trying to fix yourself all the time is exhausting. It's living at war with yourself. When spending less than you earn becomes natural, you're no longer constantly fighting your impulses. You simply created an environment where they have less power. And that's far more effective than willpower. After this stage, the person begins to realize they no longer need constant motivation to keep going. They don't depend on inspirational videos, catchphrases, or miracle promises. They continue because stopping no longer makes sense. Spending everything you earn now feels strange, uncomfortable, almost emotionally irresponsible. Not for moral reasons, but because you've already felt, in your own body, the cost of living without margin. This inversion is powerful. What once required effort now requires effort to abandon. And when something reaches that point, it sustains itself. It's not rigid discipline. It's practical identity. You're not trying to spend less than you earn. You're someone who lives that way as best you can with mistakes, adjustments, and continuity. This identity brings a new tranquility. You no longer feel like you're always behind in life. You no longer feel like everyone else understood something you didn't. You start trusting your own pace. And trusting your own pace is liberating because it removes the destructive rush that leads to bad decisions. With this base consolidated, the relationship with money finally becomes proportional to its real importance. It stops being the center of emotions and becomes silent support. You don't think about it all the time, but you feel when it's there, like solid ground under your feet. You don't thank the ground at every step, but you notice when it's missing. This emotional stability allows something that once seemed impossible, thinking about the future without fear, not an idealized, distant, perfect future. But the next step, the next adjustment, the next slightly better choice, spending less than you earn doesn't create a magical future, but it creates enough continuity for the future to stop being scary. At that moment, the person understands that the greatest achievement wasn't financial, it was psychological. It was leaving the constant state of alert. It was stopping living in anticipation of the next impact. It was learning that life has ups and downs, but that not every low has to turn into desperation. This understanding changes how you live, not just how you spend. That's why so many people who get here never go back to the previous chaos. Not because they got rich, but because they became lucid. Because they understood the invisible price of living without margin. Because they felt the real relief of not always being at the limit. And once you feel that, giving it up feels too expensive. Spending less than you earn, in the end, is not about money left over. It's about mental space. It's about being able to breathe between one problem and another. It's about treating your own life with less internal violence. And when you understand that, the habit stops feeling heavy and starts feeling obvious. When the person reaches this stage, they realize something they had never stopped to formulate. Money stopped being the central problem of life, even without becoming abundant. This breaks a deep, almost automatic belief that tranquility only exists when there is plenty left over. Now, it's clear that tranquility came before the big surplus. It came from minimal organization, basic predictability, the feeling that not everything is out of control. And that completely changes how they interpret their own story. Before, the internal narrative was always heavy. I don't know how to deal with money. I always mess up. I'll never get anywhere. These phrases felt like absolute truths. Now, they lose strength. Not because better motivational phrases appeared, but because reality began to contradict them. Spending less than you earn, repeated over time, creates silent evidence of competence. Small, discreet, but real. And evidence changes beliefs. This shift in internal narrative is one of the deepest parts of the entire process. Because while you see yourself as incapable, any attempt to improve becomes a fragile exception. When you start seeing yourself as someone under construction, every step counts. Every month counts. Every adjustment counts. And that creates a much healthier relationship with mistakes and successes. At this point, the person understands that they didn't need more pressure. They needed more structure. They needed a simple system that protected them from their own moments of exhaustion, anxiety, and spending less than you earn didn't solve everything, but it created that system. A system that doesn't demand perfection, only continuity. And continuity is something ordinary people can sustain. This understanding also changes how the person listens to financial advice. Before, everything seemed distant, too technical, or unrealistic. Now, they can filter, they can separate what makes sense from what is fantasy. Because there is internal ground that allows calm evaluation, urgency is diminished, and when urgency diminishes, discernment increases. With that, a new autonomy emerges. You no longer depend so much on external opinions to decide. You trust your perception more. Not because you know everything, but because you know how to observe. You know how to feel when something weighs too much. You know how to recognize when a decision threatens the margin you've built. And this sensitivity is an advanced form of financial intelligence, even if it never gets that name.
Little by little, money stops being a subject loaded with emotion and becomes a practical subject. It enters the conversation when it needs to, leaves when it doesn't. You solve, adjust, move on. Without internal drama, without excessive dramatization. That doesn't mean coldness. It means maturity. It means money is finally serving life, not the other way around. And when that happens, something very important consolidates. You no longer feel like you're always starting from zero. Financial life gains memory. Effort accumulates. Decisions have lasting effects. This creates a sense of continuous progress, even when the numbers are still modest. And continuous progress is one of the greatest sources of real motivation there is. There comes a moment when the person realizes they're no longer financially surviving. They're simply living. This realization doesn't come as euphoria. It comes as quietness. You look at your own routine and understand that it no longer revolves around the fear of money running out. Money still matters, of course, but it doesn't dictate every emotion, every decision, every sleepless night. And that is a profound change, because constant fear consumes an energy we only notice when it stops being drained. Before, much of the exhaustion came from a permanent state of alert. Even in moments of rest, the mind didn't rest. There was always a bill, a deadline, a what if. Now, that noise diminishes. It doesn't disappear completely, but it stops being dominant. You can be present in small things without feeling like you're running away from a bigger problem. And that improves life in a way no amount of money directly buys. This new relationship with money also changes how you deal with emotional setbacks. A bad day at work doesn't automatically turn into an impulsive expense. Extreme exhaustion no longer needs to be numbed with consumption. You begin to realize that many past purchases were not desire. They were attempts at relief. And when relief comes from somewhere else, consumption loses strength without effort. This is where spending less than you earn shows its most silent and most powerful face. It gives back emotional autonomy. You're no longer as hostage to your own impulses. Not because impulses disappeared, but because now they don't command everything. There's space between feeling and acting. And that space is maturity. With this autonomy, the person starts seeing money as part of a larger system of self-care, like sleeping better, eating better, organizing the house, respecting limits. Spending less than you earn enters that set as an adult act of self-care. Not glamorous, not showcased, but deeply effective. It's doing today something that future you will thank you for. This perception changes the relationship with sacrifice. Before, any restraint felt like loss. Now it starts to feel like choice. You don't stop spending because you can't, but because you prefer to maintain the stability you've built. When the choice is conscious, it doesn't generate resentment. It generates tranquility. At this stage, the person understands something that at the beginning seemed impossible to accept. Spending less than you earn doesn't limit life. It defines it. And defining is not impoverishing, it's organizing. It's knowing how far you can go without hurting yourself. It's recognizing limits as protection, not punishment. This change in perspective removes the moral weight from financial organization. That's why, when someone gets here, they rarely go back to the old pattern. Not because they'll never make mistakes again, but because now they know the real cost of living without margin. They know how much it costs in anxiety and sleepless nights and bad decisions. And once you see that cost clearly, ignoring it stops being a comfortable option. At the end of this whole path, the person realizes that spending less than you earn was never about becoming rigid, boring, or excessively controlled. It was about stopping living while hurting yourself without realizing it. It was about leaving that state where each month felt like an isolated fight, disconnected from the previous one, where all effort was lost. Now there is continuity. There is history. There is a line connecting what you do today to what you live tomorrow. This realization brings a sense of internal closure, not of an ending, but of understanding. You understand why you suffered so much with money for years. You understand why you tried so many times and gave up. You understand why you felt guilt even when you were trying to do the right thing. And that understanding dissolves much of the old pain. It doesn't erase the past, but it removes its emotional weight. This is where money finally loses the exaggerated symbolic power it had. It stops representing failure, comparison, fear, or shame. It becomes what it always should have been, a limited, imperfect, but manageable resource. Something you learn to use without defining yourself by it. And when that happens, the relationship with money normalizes. It stops being drama and becomes logistics. At this point, spending less than you earn reveals itself as the simplest and most transformative habit in financial life. Not because it makes you rich, but because it gives you back clarity, gives you back the ability to think, decide, and adjust without desperation. It takes you out of emergency mode and puts you into real-life mode. And if you made it this far, you might be realizing that none of this was ever about spreadsheets, elaborate calculations, or unrealistic promises. It was about creating enough mental space to live without always being at war with yourself. It was about understanding that money doesn't need to solve everything. It just needs to stop getting in the way. Spending less than you earn is the point where financial life stops being a constant emotional problem and becomes just a part of life, with its limits and possibilities. It's not magical, it's not fast, it's not glamorous, but it's real. That's exactly why it works. If you identified with this story, with this exhaustion, with this feeling of always being at the limit, know that there's nothing wrong with you. What was missing wasn't willpower, it was margin. Margin is built, little by little, the way you can, within the life you have. If you made it this far, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment the word asterisk, asterisk margin, asterisk asterisk, so I know you watched this video until the end. That helps me keep bringing content that talks about money as real life, not empty promises.